I usually talk, never mind. I was going to ask if my microphone is on. I can tell that it is. It is my pleasure to be here with you at the Roebuck Parkway congregation today, and I am honored to be working with you in this gospel meeting. Somebody asked me about the humidity this morning, and the best primer I could have for that is I just spent 2 weeks in Cambodia. So it feels nice and dry here compared to what I've been experiencing. I know that when I say that I'm from Denver, Colorado, some facts or some thoughts are already rolling around in your mind. In fact, it's so bad that when I was in California, they were talking about our marijuana laws. So I'm sure you're wondering if everybody's out on the street and doing that. They're not, but give us a couple of years. I hope that we'll wise up in our government and so forth. We're here to talk about this week God's plan and how that impacts us. We're going to be looking at that from a great many different angles. But I thought during our Bible class this morning that I would take some time to talk in the very basic sense about what God has given us in the Word. As I mentioned a moment ago, I was in Cambodia for a couple of weeks, a country 95% of which claim to be Buddhists. Very few people believe in the God of the Bible in the country of Cambodia. And those who have heard about Christ are very few in number, and they have a very limited understanding of God's Word. And so when you go into a place like that, you really have to start at square one. And yet I have found in sitting down and studying with people one-on-one, and even as I've interacted with a good many of the members of God's people, there is a need for us not to assume what we know and understand about the Bible. Our culture and our society is changing. This used to be known as a Christian nation, and I think it's fair for us to say that it's a post-Christian nation. That as time marches on, fewer people know less about the book, God's book, the Word of God. Now, I think there's a great many reasons why people don't know and don't study their Bibles like they should. And inasmuch as this is a Bible class, if you might help me a little bit this morning as we get started, to understand why. What are some of the excuses that people give for not studying the Bible? I'm too busy. You think about this, our society and all that we've got to get done. We live in an age of technology, and yet it seems like we have less time. Where do I fit it in with all the responsibilities I have? We're too busy. What else? What are other reasons or excuses people give for not studying? Okay, it's relevance, it's importance. I mean, we're an enlightened people, and as an educated sort, then it seems something that's archaic or something that just doesn't have application in life. Now, those of us who teach and who preach need to do our work in studying the Word so that we can help folks to see how relevant and how applicable the Bible is. But a lot of people don't pick it up because they think that very thing. Somebody else said something else. All right, there are a couple of things here that are very important. Somebody said time. Now you think about how... Tired, okay. All right, so I think about, I don't know how you guys, what your habits are. I love to read, but I love to read nonfiction books. And so my time to read is at night because I'm doing so much during the day. That's my time to unwind. And I don't take sleeping pills. I read a book. It takes about a half a paragraph and I'm gone. I'm so tired. And that's how people are with regard to the Bible. I'm exhausted when it comes time for me to sit down and open up the book. I want to key in on all the other answers that could be given on the answer that was just said. It's hard for me to understand the Bible. I wonder if there would be some people who would undertake studying the Bible if they felt like they could understand it. I mean, when you begin to look at the Bible, you see that there are 1,189 chapters of the Bible, 31,104 verses. And if you have a study Bible like I have, look how thick it is and how intimidating it can seem. And how many times has a person begun their journey in the Bible and they begin to study in the book of Genesis, and as they begin to read the narrative style of the book of Genesis as Moses is inspired to write it, and you read about the creation and you read about the fall and you read about Noah, and as you go through it's a riveting study. It's exciting. And then you get to Exodus, and here's Moses, and he goes to the Pharaoh. There's the 10 plagues, there's the Exodus, there's the receiving of the law up on Mount Sinai. And you get around about chapter 25. There's all this tedious detail with regard to the tabernacle and its furnishings and all of these requirements. And then you get to Leviticus, and there's all these minute laws with regard to the priesthood. If you're able to weather that and you get to the book of Numbers, then there are some very interesting stories as we read about that faithless generation that will not enter into the promised land and some of the things that happen when they are wandering. But then you get to Deuteronomy and the second giving of the law, and there's all this detail, and people say, I just don't even know how to make sense of it. I don't understand what the plot is. I don't understand what the theme is. I really just don't comprehend. Hopefully, what we're going to talk about this morning will serve a dual purpose. Hopefully, it will reinforce what you know and what you understand with regard to the Bible, but more importantly, what we will see today will provide for you a skeletal outline that you can put meat on in your own study life, but as you also speak to those people who need to know more about the Lord and His Word. I did hand you some pieces of paper. And I don't know where they all went. I'm very grateful to the young men. I believe one of the fellows said his name was Seth, and whoever was with him. Appreciate the help on that. I don't know where it's at, but if you would, somebody tell me what you have in your hand. Parts of photos. Now, how do you know it's a photo? Okay, well, we'll take your word for it, all right? Well, ma'am, right next to him, what do you got? Okay, all right, so we've got interpreters here. They're determining what kind of paper they have there. It's a photo, looks like some land. Who else? A blank piece of paper. Well, I'm sorry, you got shortchanged there, all right? So we got photo, land, blank piece of paper. All right, we've got one with a little bit more detail here. We've got some trees. What else? All right, another interpretation. It's not just ground, it's rough ground. All right, what else? A lady. That's very interesting. I hope you and I have the same picture. I don't think there's any people in it, but it could. It looks like a lady. All right. Anything else that's different? Trees. Shoreline. Another interesting detail. Now, I think there's about 50 or 60 pieces scattered around this room. And if we had the time and if we had the inclination, we could take all those individual pieces and we could put them together. And when we put them together, what we would have would be an entire picture. And when you put that together, I'm going to look again more closely when I can to see if there is a lady in it, but we have St. Mary's Glacier that is backdropped by Mount Evans, and you have those blank pieces of paper or the white clouds in the sky. It's the whole picture. What you had was a piece of the whole picture. And you could not possibly conceive that this was what the whole thing looked like by looking at the one piece that you had. Suppose that the purpose of this Bible class or the theme of the lesson was to explain the entire theme of the Bible using only the book of Obadiah. Would anybody want to take up that challenge? You didn't have the other pieces, just Obadiah. You couldn't do it. What if it was the book of Genesis? I mean, Genesis is a foundational book upon which the rest of the Bible is built, but if that's the only piece that you had, would you have the whole picture? Or what about the book of Acts, the hub of the Bible, the centerpiece, the history of the church? As vital as it is, isolated by itself, it would be an incomplete picture, just a fragment. And the interpretations that you made with regard to those individual pieces would not give you the whole picture. There's a beautiful thing when we go to study the Bible, and that is that wherever we are studying, if it's in Genesis, if it's in Obadiah, if it's in Acts, Revelation, or anywhere in between, God is developing that theme, that one united theme. And when we look at the Bible, as we condense it down in those 66 chapters, or 66 books, which we would call 66 chapters of the one book, the Bible, with it broken down into its 1,189 chapters and over 31,000 verses, its theme is singular. God wrote this book for us to understand the need of the salvation of man through Christ to God's glory. And as we read, we see that being developed. Now, I mentioned a moment ago, as you look in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, it is being developed for us in narrative form. The different sections of the Bible are devoted to different types of literature. But if you look at this book, it's a historical document. There is a study that can be done of the Old and the New Testament in which you can see it historically and that it's verified by history. But as you look at the Bible and you look at it historically, you can see the Bible as His story, the story of Christ. When we go to this book, we see that it's revealing for us our need of salvation. And as I look at this room, there are folks of different ages. I imagine there are folks of different income and economic brackets. There are folks of different races, but we're all bound together by this one fact and this one truth, and that is that we're sinners. In the book of Romans, in Paul's great treatise, the first half of which, in fact the first 11 chapters of which, is very strongly doctrinal in its nature, he begins in a very practical way. In Romans chapter 1, verse 18 through 32, Paul addresses the Gentile segment of this congregation, and he says, every sin that one could commit, you have committed. I mean, it is the longest, most scathing rebuke of sin in the Bible. Every imaginable sin is listed in there, and at the end of it, there's an inescapable conclusion that all Gentiles are sinners. And you can almost hear the Jews in the background saying, amen, Brother Paul, you tell, oh sorry Gentiles, what sinners they are. But what does Paul do in Romans chapter 2? He says, you that have the law, you're without excuse. You who say do not kill, do you kill? You who say do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? And so when Paul is done with Romans chapter 2, the inescapable conclusion is all Jews are sinners. So what would we expect Paul's conclusion of that particular discussion to be? In Romans chapter 3 and verse 10, he says, there is none righteous, no, not one. And we all know Romans 3:23, don't we? What does Paul say there? For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. As I analyze that from a grammatical standpoint, I say that when it says all have sinned, I'm looking at what? My past. You see, an accountable being looks back and in that accountable period can see sin in the rearview mirror. But then Paul indicates for us the present struggle, doesn't he? And fall short of God's glory. This book, according to James chapter 1, is a mirror into which I can look and see myself as I really am. The blemishes, the flaws, the shortcomings, and I need that. You see, I'm not going to be saved unless I understand that I'm lost. If I understand that I'm lost, I'm going to long for the forgiveness that God provides. And so this book tells me, Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 20, there's not a just person upon earth that does good and does not sin. But by one man sin entered into the world, and by him death entered into the world. In Romans chapter 5, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we understand our common plight of sin. We know that the whole world lies under the sway of the wicked one, 1 John 5 and verse 19. So wherever I'm reading that need I have of salvation. But how does it come? It comes through Christ. Remember, historically, the Bible is His story. The Bible is written for us to understand that Jesus Christ is the answer to the sin problem that we all face. A great illustration of this is in John chapter 4. And you remember the evolution of thought in the Samaritan woman's mind when Jesus comes to her and begins to speak to her, and she goes from thinking of Him merely as a Jew to being a teacher, to being a prophet, to finally being the Messiah. And then He goes with her to her village, and there the people see Jesus in action, and after a few days they say in verse 42 that now we know that you are the Messiah, not because of this woman, but because of our own eyes. The people who honestly encounter Jesus see Him for what He is claimed to be, the perfect Son of God, the one who comes by way of the virgin birth, the one who lives a perfect life without sin, though tempted like all of us, Hebrews 4:15, who goes to the cross and dies on our behalf, is buried in a tomb, is raised the third day, ascends to heaven, and is now at the right hand of the throne of God. God's answer to our problem. That's what you're reading in the Bible. And why? This is unfathomable, so that God will be glorified. You know, being from Colorado, another thing is that we have a lot of folks that sometimes are referred to as, the kind word is environmentalists, some call it tree huggers, and they would try to tell us that everybody and everything is completely equal. That a tree is just as important as a human being and has just as much inherent value. But in the first chapter of the Bible, I understand that that's not exactly right. Because of all of God's creation, I understand that God made man in His image and after His likeness. And so God made me like Him. There is a part of me that is made in the image of God. And I understand that when God made me, He made me in sinless perfection. And through that, He's glorified. And when I respond in a way that is in accordance with His will and in His favor, that I'm exalted, not because of who I am, but because of who He is. But when I sin, I bring disgrace and dishonor and hurt and shame on God. So why, after I chose to sin and fall short of the glory of God, would He still give that greatest gift of Jesus on my behalf? You know, about 20 years ago, almost 21, I began to get a little bit of a faint picture of that. My oldest son's going to turn 21 this November. And I remember with all of them, those stages through which they go. It seems like forever ago now. But I remember those days when they're sitting in the high chair. And you're sitting there stealing a moment and saying to that child, I love you. I love you. And what are you trying to do? You're trying to get the child to say it back to you. And you know, there's a time in which they begin to mimic that, right? Because God has made us so intelligent. And as that little child, not even really comprehending, can begin to say in some form those words. But do you remember, moms and dads, the day that that little boy or that little girl came to you for the first time without solicitation, without any kind of coaxing on your part, and that little child said, I love you. Boy, it's probably a moment that you wrote in your little book for each of those little children. Unsolicited, on their own. How did it make you feel? Now, God, in giving His Son, realizes that the masses of humanity, the majority, are going to reject Him, but He lives in that perfect and everlasting hope. They're going to be those of His children who, on their own volition, will be obedient to Him and live in such a way that they demonstrate of their own free will their love for God. And how does that make the perfect, loving God feel? Now, what we're talking about is the story of the Bible. And wherever we're reading, we're seeing that theme unfold, the salvation of man through Christ to the glory of God. What I want to do in the few minutes that we have is just to very quickly give a skeletal idea of the Bible, something that we can take and we can share with those who are lost around us. As we look in our Bibles, we see first of all that the Messiah is needed in Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 3 and verse 14. And we can remember 5 words that captures those first 3 chapters of the Bible. First of all is the people, Adam and Eve. Second is the place, the Garden of Eden. Third is the precept, and that is don't eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then there is the penalty. The day you eat thereof, you shall surely die. And there's the presumption of Adam and Eve in that they took of that fruit. Now, as we think about what takes place in the garden, God created man in paradise perfectly. When God created Adam and then Eve, they were without sin. And if we wanted to envision it this way, there was that point in time in which before sin, man and God were united in fellowship. But then because of that presumptuous act, that taking of that fruit, which Eve did first and then Adam, their eyes were open and they realized that they were separated from God. God comes to them in the cool of the garden and He approaches the head of the household first, Adam, and He says, where are you? Remember what Adam says? He says, I'm hiding. Why are you hiding? I'm afraid. Why are you afraid? Because I'm naked. Who told you you were naked? You remember how Adam mans up and takes responsibility for his actions? No. He said, it's the woman you gave me. So God, it's her fault, and really in a way it's your fault because you gave her to me. God doesn't dignify that answer with a response. Instead, He turns to the woman and asks her what she's done. And at least somebody in the household would own up to it, right? No, she says, the serpent. But the net effect is that no matter who they blamed, they found themselves separated from God. That fellowship that was once enjoyed, now there's a gap. And the question is, what could man do to make things right with God? What could he do? Not a thing. God had to provide the answer. And so, number two, we see that the Messiah is promised in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. And as we think about what's taking place there in this promise that's foreshadowed, that we see later on in Genesis 49 and verse 10, and throughout the writings of the Old Testament, pointing ahead at a day in which the Messiah would come, what God is saying is, I'm binding myself by my perfect character to fulfill the promise that I'm making, and that is to provide an answer. If you want to think about it this way, God says, I'm going to build a bridge that will provide a way for you to come back to me. You can't do it. I'm going to have to do it. And I'm going to do it. Now, have you ever made a promise that you didn't keep? If you're a human being and you've lived for any length of time, you know that you have. You've broken promises. Now, that's not right, but we're human. God's perfect. And if God makes a promise, He has got to fulfill it. His character, His nature's on the line. And so right here we see God beginning to build the bridge that's going to result in Jesus coming. So number three, we have the Messianic genealogies. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. And if you want to think about it this way there in Genesis chapter 4 and 5, these are the planks on the bridge of time that are leading us ever closer to Christ. Number 4, in Genesis chapter 6 through 9, we have the Messianic line preserved. And who's the hero of Genesis 6 through 9? Noah. All right, what were the conditions of things in Noah's day? What were things like in his world? All right, I love that Bible answer. In Genesis chapter 6, it says that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart were only evil continually. Some of you have lived for a little bit of time. You've noticed a change in society. It's kind of gone, it's deteriorated morally. Have we gotten to that point yet? When you get in your car in the morning, you go to job, or you go to school, or you go to the mall, or whatever it is, and when you leave your house and you drive down the highway and you get on the interstate, that every accountable being in every one of those cars is thinking only evil continually? And yet what really encourages me is that even in a world that was that depraved, Noah was able to be a successful parent. Well, what an encouragement. But I want you to think about that period of time from another aspect. You know, when people talk about the God of the Old Testament, what are some of the terms they use in describing His nature? God is a God of, in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament. I like that, and you think you're right. He's a God of wrath, God of justice, God of holiness, the God of the New Testament, God of love, God of mercy. Now, both of those answers are partially right, aren't they? The God of the Old Testament is a God of wrath. He is a God of justice. He is a God of holiness. But so is the God of the New Testament, as Ananias and Sapphira would testify. But the God of the Old Testament was not only a God of wrath, not only a God of justice, but He was a God of grace and a God of love. Noah did not merit the job that he inherited, though he was a good man. But Genesis chapter 6 and verse 8 says, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And what I want you to think about as you look at Genesis 6 through 9, there's so many great New Testament lessons there, that salvation was located. You had to be on the ark in order to be saved. That God used Noah in a day of wickedness. But the thing that I want you to remember is God made a promise back here. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. And God's got to keep the promise. And even though almost all the world is destroyed, 8 souls got on that ark. And on the other side, the bridge is still being built. So number 5, we have the Messianic genealogies continuing. Tracing through Seth. Seth, Arphaxad, Selah, Eber, Peleg, Reu, Serug, Nahor, Terah, and Abraham. What do we have? More planks on the bridge, leading us closer to the answer. But then we have the Messianic genealogies in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And there are essentially how many promises given to Abraham? It's okay. I'll refine it if it's not exactly the right number. How many do you think? Ultimately, one. But we can break it down into two, can't we? What is he promising? I'm going to make of you what? A great nation. There's the nation promise. And what's the other promise? Through your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Now, right here, drive down a peg on that bridge. God's made two promises. I'm going to make of you a great nation. We're going to talk more about that in the worship hour this morning. And from your seed, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. The first fulfillment is through whom? Who's the fulfillment of the first promise? The great nation. It's Israel, right? It's the Jews. And through your seed, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. Who's the fulfillment of that? That's what we're talking about, Jesus. The way back to the Father. And so we have God binding Himself again. So Genesis 12 through Genesis chapter 50 is God giving that promise to Abraham, giving it again to Isaac, and then again to Jacob. And that's the book of Genesis. And so we're going to look at the other 65 books here in the next 7 to 10 minutes. The next thing we notice is the Messianic nation being formed by way of the people. I guess it's good for us to answer a civics question. What do you need for a nation to exist? I've already given you one of the elements, right? People. Got to have law. Somebody else said it. Place, territory. So here's God. He's fulfilling His promise because He's God. His nature's perfect. He gives us the first part of that. He's going to give us that Messianic nation by way of the people. And that's Exodus chapter 1 through 19. You remember we left out one important character in the book of Genesis. Toward the end of the book of Genesis, he dominates. His name is Joseph, Jacob's favorite child. And we learn from that the lack of wisdom in favoring one of our children over others. But God also uses that to execute His providence in keeping the nation alive through that time of famine to bring the children, the household of Jacob, into the land of Egypt through that famine that comes. They settle in the land of Goshen, and there they grow. And by the time we get to the book of Exodus, they are flourishing. So much so that there's a Pharaoh who does not remember what Joseph had done, and they begin to oppress them and put them into bondage, in which they are put for hundreds of years. Who's the hero of this part of the Bible? Perhaps the greatest character of the Old Testament. Moses. All right, so God commissions Moses, and there's great lessons on leadership and the resistance of this man who was definitely qualified. He did not desire the work, but God saw that he was qualified, and ultimately he did the work. He goes to Pharaoh and he says, "Let my people go." He knows he's not going to allow that to happen, so God demonstrates His power and His supremacy over the Egyptian gods to show us, as the Bible continually does, there's no God like Jehovah. And then, as a result of that, they leave. On the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, the observance of the Passover, they make their way on the way to the Promised Land. Isn't it amazing? God is providing for them all the way. He has a desire for them. He wants to bless them. And He's doing all of this and then asking them to trust Him and to obey Him. Here they are, Exodus chapter 19. They've left. That brings us to the next point, and that's the Messianic nation by way of law. And that's Exodus chapter 20 through the book of Deuteronomy. And there we see the law that's given, and in Exodus chapter 24, it's sealed with blood as the second tablets that Moses brings down. We remember what happens to the first and the golden calf. But he comes and he brings these tablets and he sprinkles them with blood, and he sprinkles the people, and they enter into this covenant in which they obey God. God blesses them. They disobey God. God's going to curse them. We have Ebal, Gerizim, and you can read about that, the mountain of blessing, the mountain of cursing. But here we have the people of God given now a law. And if there was a law that could save through meritorious works, it would be this law. But no one could keep it perfectly save Jesus, who was yet to come. Exodus 20 through Deuteronomy have the giving of the law. Deuteronomy is the second giving of the law. In between, we have the faithless generation, Moses' generation, who would not accept the promise that God had given to them. I want you to remember what we had said. God had carried them all the way to the cusp of the Promised Land, and He just simply says, "Go and take it." And they don't do it. 40 days it's spied out by the 12 spies. Because they listened to the majority report, people like to listen to the majority. The minority was saying we're well able. The majority said we're not able. The people listened to the majority, and because of that, a generation lost their lives. But then another generation comes, and the next point we have the Messianic nation by way of territory. God has fulfilled the first promise. We have a nation, people, law, and now territory. God's building a bridge to get us ever closer to Christ, and now He has fulfilled this promise to make a great nation. But then we have the Messianic nation before it becomes a kingdom. That's the next point, and that's the period of Judges. That's Judges through 1 Samuel chapter 8. And you know them: Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Abimelech, Tola, Jared, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, Samson, Eli, and Samuel. We'll talk about him in our 1 o'clock service. What was life like during the period of the Judges? Do you remember? Judges 17:6, Judges 21:25, the theme verses of the book of Judges. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. Well, I'm glad we've grown beyond that, aren't you? That's life, isn't it? That's human nature. That's how people are. People like to be self-governed. But what's amazing is, here's God trying to fulfill His plan, and we have a people who don't have some of those centralizing things like a government or a seat of government. And yet God holds them together through their common religious ancestry and their common promise. 300 plus years. And then Samuel, of course, in his day, you remember in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the people say, your sons aren't walking in the right way, and we want a king to be like the nations around us. And God acquiesces and allows them to have what they want. We've got to be very careful sometimes what we're praying for, because God may grant it, and it may not be what's best. We need to pray in all things, not just health, your will be done. So we now have, the next point would be the Messianic kingdom, that Israelite kingdom is established, and it's the united kingdom. In 1 Samuel chapter 9 through 1 Kings chapter 12, and it covers really the reign of 3 kings. Do you know who they are? Who's the first king? Saul. That's all right. Saul, who was appointed by Samuel, David, and Solomon. 120 years, 3 reigns, and Israel's united. Isn't it remarkable? They can't go beyond that. By the way, the books of Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon are written during this period of time. The book of Job more than likely belongs in the book of Genesis because of some of the evidence that we see therein. So here you have the united kingdom. But then it divides, and there's 2 reasons why it divides. It divides because Solomon allows his hearts to be led away by the gods of his wives. I remember my son was in Bible class and was trying to figure that out. And his teacher said, what's the problem with Solomon having all those wives and concubines? He said, well, how do he remember all their names? I think he had bigger problems than that, didn't he? That is, that they led him away from Jehovah God. And because of that, God's going to rend the kingdom from him, but because of David, his father, He's going to give him a remnant of that kingdom, that southern kingdom known as Judah. The northern kingdom is going to retain the name of Israel, those 10 tribes. So the next point is that the kingdom divides. That's 1 Kings chapter 12 through 2 Kings chapter 17. And the other occasion, of course, was Rehoboam. He didn't listen to the wise counsel of the elderly. He listened to his own peers, and as a result of that, the kingdom is rent in 2. And during that particular time, God sends the prophets Isaiah, Hosea, Jonah, Amos, and Micah. Sends these great prophets, and also non-writing prophets like Elijah and Elisha, pleading with Israel to come back to God. And in those 21 reigns of the Israelite kings, how many were righteous, approximately? Round figure? The roundest figure. 0. None of them. And so eventually, God says, I've given you up. And they go into Syrian captivity and they're destroyed. I want you to think about this. 10/12 of the nation of Israel is gone. But what's God doing in the background? He's building a bridge. His promise is intact. It's still going. The next point is we have the Messianic kingdom, Judah alone, and that's the rest of the Old Testament. As we look at it being divided into 3 sub-periods, and that is before Babylonian captivity, during Babylonian captivity, and after Babylonian captivity. Before Babylonian captivity, you have the kings of Judah alone. Although they're running alongside of Israel through part of that, there are a few righteous kings of Judah. There's Josiah, there's Hezekiah, and there's Jehoshaphat and some others, and Asa, who are righteous, but by and large they're unrighteous. And God sends Jeremiah, Obadiah, Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah, among others, to say, come back to me. Don't be like Israel. And you know what happens? They're just like them, and they sin, and they fall short of God's glory. These David's descendants are in 3 waves sent into Babylonian captivity, during which the books of Ezekiel and Daniel are written. In the book of Daniel, which we had time to talk about it, we have this glorious look at a coming kingdom. It's an everlasting kingdom that shall never be destroyed. He's foreshadowing the church, and we can trace in Matthew 16, 18, 16, 28, in Acts chapter 1, Acts chapter 2, and we can see that kingdom being fulfilled in the promise of the church. But a remnant comes out of that captivity. And then we have the rest of the Old Testament, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, and then Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. And yet we still see God's people falling short and God still being faithful and true, leading us to that point in which Jesus will be born. Then we have the next point, and that's the Messianic kingdom between the Testaments. 400 years, very important. Daniel talks about it in Daniel chapter 2. These 4 successive kingdoms that are going to come. It's the Babylonian captivity, it's the Medo-Persians, or Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greeks, and then the Romans. And all of this is setting the stage for the coming of the Messiah, because we have the roads that are improved, we have the common language, we have the time of peace, and we have the structure so that the gospel can spread quickly. And then we have the Messianic kingdom, the Messiah comes. And that's Matthew through John. 4 different perspectives for 4 different audiences. 4 different ways to prove that Jesus is that one of promise that God has been intending from out in eternity as the solution to the problem that all of us face. So we've walked across the planks of the bridge as we've read the Old Testament, and when we get to the New Testament, we're seeing the revelation of what God has been talking about through those first 4,000 years of time. But then we have the Messianic kingdom, the kingdom established. That's the book of Acts. And in chapters 1 through 9, we see the establishment. In chapters 10 through 28, we see the kingdom expanded, the church as it goes out into the uttermost parts of the earth. And Acts 1, 8 through 11 gives us the foreshadowing of that by saying you're going to begin in Jerusalem, then go to Judea, Samaria, and then the uttermost parts of the earth. And that's exactly what the disciples do. And then as we look at Romans through Jude, we have the Messianic kingdom and how you live life therein. If it's a kingdom, it's got a king. It's got a territory, the church. It's got a headquarters, heaven. And it's got law. It's the perfect law of liberty. It's the law of Christ. And we are subjects in that kingdom to live. And so as I look at Romans through Jude, here's God telling me, this is what the Bible is all about in your daily life. And then I get to the end, and I look at the all-important book of Revelation, which is written to talk about the Christians of the first century being faithful through the persecution that they were enduring at the hands of the Romans. But in there is a message for us of hopefulness, that if we hang on, John's saying, I've seen the end, and we're going to win, we're going to be victorious. Those that overcome can come over. And that's the book of Revelation telling us how it's going to end for those who come to Christ and come into relationship with Christ. That we have a heaven to gain, which we're going to talk about on Wednesday night. What do we have? In the Bible, in those 66 chapters, we have the unfolding of that one thing, the salvation of man through Christ to the glory of God. What we have seen very briefly this morning is an outline that we can take and use as a platform to build a greater knowledge of the Word of God and to be more confident when we're standing before those or sitting across the table from those who need the saving love of our great God. Thank you so much for your kind attention this morning.